My process for creating eyelids is pretty straightforward. It uses a local rig with dual quaternion skinning, and then I make sure every single eyelid control or joint share the exact same pivot. So for instance, I'll just highlight my move tool so we can quickly see the pivot. You see it is right there with the major lower lid, and if I select each of these guys, it's all along that exact same pivot. You know that it'll perfectly rotate around the eyeball. Now the reason this works is only because we're using dual quaternion skinning. So if I unhide the target group on the full rig, and I've set a few keys here of the lid raising, you'll see it's rotating around the eyelid nicely, and that's because of the dual quaternion skinning. So if I select this, go to the skin cluster, and switch it back to linear, you'll see it's doing this nasty kind of pulling deformation. And that's how skinning normally works, is that the verts that are valued 100% to this joint are completely rotating around, but as they fall off closer to 0, they start getting skewed. Now this can be helpful in a lot of scenarios, but dual quaternion gets us a much more predictable, perfect rotation. So whenever you want something like this, it's a good idea to use dual quaternion. However, dual quaternion is not stable enough to be used in combination with scale a lot of the time, so we're safe to use it on this local rig because it's piped in through a blend shape. So if you scale anything on her head, it's not going to be affecting the dual quaternion solver in any way. We're just going to be using rotation. With this setup, I do allow these rotation joints or controls to be scaled. From what I gather, and don't quote me on this, but it seems like the issue with dual quaternion scaling has to do with if you're affecting objects underneath each other in a hierarchy. So maybe if you were to scale the parent and then rotate a child, you might see some issues. But so far, by just rotating and scaling just the one control that this situation uses, I haven't encountered any issues. But as a general rule, dual quaternion plus scaling doesn't really work. At some point that might be fixed. I know in a lot of big studios they've developed their own spin-offs of dual quaternion where they've solved the scaling issue, but as far as I know, Maya or Autodesk hasn't solved it yet, or at least hasn't implemented it yet. So let's jump over to our file. So let's duplicate this guy off. First we'll disable all this just in case anything isn't at 0. And let's actually leave this guy down here and just call this duplicate me, and we can duplicate this off if we need to in the future without having to worry about all the unlocking. So we'll duplicate this guy, bring him up. Let's call this head local lids TGT. Shift select our global geometry, edit deformers, blend shape, add. It's going to make us select it. And then let us just turn it on. Okay. One thing I forgot, we actually do need the eyeball in there because we're going to be snapping to it. Let's just use this joint. We just need this up there so we can snap objects to its pivot. Duplicate that. Let's actually bring this back down to 0 and move them together. Okay. I don't believe we'll need one on the right side because we're just going to mirror over our joints. Let's move this guy over to our target group. So let's actually use this joint here. Let's make it a little bigger. use this joint here as our first lid joint. Let's call this L lid lower 01 JNT. You'll see why I named this joint instead of bind in a minute. First thing I'm going to do is orient this to be along the actual angle of the eye. So we're just going to eyeball this. It's fine if you leave it facing straight forward, but at least in the z-axis we're going to make this line up. Alright, that looks pretty close. We're just matching this with the two corners of the eye. The reason I wouldn't leave this vertical is because if we were to rotate this particular eye design straight down, this whole vertical area here would just come crashing into itself, so it makes more sense to align it with the actual angle of the eye. Okay. Freeze those transformations. Now we're going to duplicate this joint. Just add the word tip to the end and BND at the end. Now we're going to parent this to the first one, and we are just going to move this straight out. It does not matter how accurate you are with this, because we are always going to be rotating this control from the root. This is just for two purposes. For one, it is so that we can easily right-click on these and visualize them and click paint this influence and stuff like that. Otherwise, they'd all be sitting on the exact same point in space and would be very difficult to tell apart, if not impossible. The other reason is that when we mirror our joints over, or rather when we mirror our skin influence onto the corresponding right side joints, if they're all on the same pivot or at the same point in space, Maya won't know where to throw the mirrored vertex influence. But if we're painting these children instead, they're all in their own point in space, and it'll easily know where to throw them when it mirrors. So I'm going to choose to go 4 across for the bottom and 4 across for the top. For this lecture, we're just going to go through the bottom lid. Painting the top lid is the exact same thing, so there's no reason to go through both of them. So I'm going to place this about 1/4 of the way across the bottom lid. Again, you don't have to be too picky with it. 2, 3, a little bit more this way. 2, a little bit this way. 1, 2, 3, 4. That should be good. You could always move it after. But we're honestly not going to worry about it because, again, the position doesn't exactly matter. All that matters is the pivot of this guy. So let's go ahead and create a locator and a group above this guy just so we have some extra control. If you're just using rotation and scale, it's fine to just set-driven key this actual joint, but if you want to create anything automated or adjust stuff later, it's still safe to have those extra buffers. So I'll use my locator group command. Make sure this all worked out. Looks good. And it froze those transformations, so we're all good. So the next thing we're going to do is duplicate this whole group. Select them all, go to search and replace, and we're going to replace 001 with 002. And then just get rid of that 1. And for this one, we're just going to grab the tip and move it over. Remember, leave the base joint in the exact same place so that it'll rotate around the eye. Alright, same process for the third one. You could actually just select the top one and choose hierarchy in this if you wanted to. Oops. And move the tip again. Last one. Alright, just going to move this last one over now. Good. So these are going to be all of our lower lid controls. So these are going to be all of our lower lid joints. Let's just make sure these all have the same pivot, make sure we didn't mess anything up. Looks good. Make sure they're all zeroed out as well. Good. So the next thing we're going to do are create the lid crease joints, which are pretty much the exact same thing, just a notch lower in space. And let's hop over to Kayla just to show you what that feature is going to do. So let's rotate this up just so you can see it a little bit better. This whole crease down here is what we're actually going to be controlling right now. Let's hide the target group to get rid of that flicker. So on the actual control here, I have these 4 options called lid crease. And if you grab all of them, you'll see it moves this whole area up and down. You could also do them individually. That's so that when she raises her eyes, you don't get this giant bagginess under her eye. You can counter that a little bit by bringing these up, which makes it a lot more appealing and helps her stay young. The one thing we're going to add after this is just one extra joint that rotates the cheek section. And all of these are still sharing that same pivot, so everything rotates directly around the eye. Before we go any further, let's group all of these lower lid joint groups together, which will serve as the actual controllable master lid control, as opposed to the 4 individual sections. So let's create a group, select one of these, and then just do a parent constraint and delete the parent constraint. I'll use my tool for that. If you wanted to, you could also create a locator to match this. I'll just go ahead and do that. Same process. Parent the locator to the group. And now let's just go ahead and parent all these to the locator. Let's name this L lid lower loc. Same thing for this, but group. Cool. So this is going to be the actual control that we move around when we want to raise her lower lid. So now that we've done that, let's select this group and duplicate it. We're going to go search and replace hierarchy, replace lid lower with lid crease lower. Looks like it worked. Get rid of that one. So now let's grab these 4 joints right here and just translate them down a tiny bit in space, just so we see that difference and Maya can mirror successfully. And lastly, let's just duplicate any of these, unparent it. Let's rename this cheek lift and cheek lift tip, and use the locator group script. Now we actually do want to get rid of this rotate Z here, because this is just going to rotate straight up and down with just the X. Okay. Let's just move this down in space. And that is it for setting up the joints for the lower lid area. Let's just group all of this together. Call it left lids group. We'd also put our upper lid and upper lid crease joints in here if we were going through that process. Let's also stick this under our local rig group. Alright, now we are ready to start skinning this. First thing we're going to want to do is set some keys for the lower lid going up and down. Now, like in some other areas that we went over in previous lessons, we're going to start with one joint that represents exactly how we want our whole lower lid to look when it goes up and down, and then we're going to steal influence from that into our 3 other lower lid controls. So if it helps you, you can go ahead and hide the crease and cheek, so we can just work with these 4 for now. And we're just going to select this one. Might as well grab the locator and set some keys. have it go all the way up. Alright. You're going to want to start with either the inner or the outer, so you can go sequentially in the opposite direction to separate out the influence into the 4 individual parts later. So let's go ahead and start painting this. Oh, actually got to skin it first. Select these 4. You could just do the one for now and add them individually later. I'll just add them all in and be a little bit more careful. All the settings as before should be fine. Now just select number 1 and flood it to 1. Oops. You know what? We actually forgot to create the head joint to grab the rest of the influence. So let's duplicate this off. Lid head. Stick it in this lid group. Doesn't really matter the orientation, but I'll zero it out just in case, or just to be safe. Alright, this guy will be our leftover weights joint. So that's the one we're actually going to want to flood to. So let's go ahead and add that influence. Make sure locked weights is on. And now just flood everything. Next thing we're going to do is lock everything except for head and number 1. So we're going to steal what we need to over into this, and it's going to represent the whole bottom lid for now. Before we go any further, let's make sure we set the skin cluster to dual quaternion. Alright, that way it'll rotate around the eye nicely. Might be a good idea to actually stick the eye geometry in here so you could see it rotating around, but we'll just trust it for now. As long as it's dual quaternion, it should perfectly rotate around according to the pivot that we used, which should be the center of the eye. So let's go to frame just a little bit, or maybe halfway up. And now we're going to start painting the lower lid. But before we do that, I'm going to select just one row of verts to start with. So let's pick the outermost one. And then deselect the upper lid area. Leave the actual, or you can remove the actual corner is what I meant. Okay, now we are actually ready to start painting. Replace 100%. Let's start with some of the middle ones. Can't even see my brush. So we want the middle area to hit around 100%. Now let's lower the opacity and start layering in some of this. If it's being buggy, you could always go to the inside. And remember, this is halfway, so we're pretty much going to want it go straight across. Though since these middle ones are at 100, let's say maybe right around here will be our half point. Before we move on from this, we want to make sure we get this one row absolutely perfect, because we're going to be smoothing some of the other rows in accordance for where this lines up with. Probably going to just fast forward through this area a little bit because it might take a little time. So that's looking pretty good. Let's bring it up a little bit higher. See if we can smooth this out a little bit. And by smooth, I don't mean actually using smooth, just using your eye. Alright, that's looking pretty good. For a full rig, we'd probably spend a little bit more time finessing it, but for now we can feel good enough to move forward. The next thing we're going to want to do is select the edge rings that lead to the crease area and smooth it out. So let's go up a few frames, select this middle row, shift period, let's say twice. Yep, that looks right. Get rid of these top guys again. Alright, now let's just smooth these a few times. Save first in case this bugs out. Looks good. Just keep smoothing it until it gets evenly spanned out and stops moving like that. Alright, looks pretty good. And because of dual quaternion, we got that perfect rotation going on. I might actually grab this one and run smooth just a few times. Maybe just once is fine. Looks good. Now the last thing we need to do before we separate this out into its individual tweak controls, or joints, is to go around to the inside and transfer all of these weights from the tips here to these few inside eye areas. So a very quick way to do that is just go to vertex mode, select the one you want, and then go to skin, edit smooth skin, copy vertex weights. And now you can select all the verts in the row behind it and do the same thing, but instead you're going to hit paste vertex weights, and that perfectly copies them over. So I'd suggest creating shortcuts on your shelf for that. I have them right here. And now I'm just going to go one by one, and I'll probably fast forward through this. Just go one by one, select the ones beneath it, and paste. Copy. Paste. As you get to this corner area, you're going to notice you might not want it to be 100% here. So you might start to get creative at this point and just start painting manually. Let's see how that works. Looks pretty good. One thing I'm seeing is this this area on the front, the normals are starting to freak out a little bit. So I might actually go into this row right here and inch it closer to the top. Turn off color feedback so we can see it. Maybe get them a little closer than you'd want so that we can run a smooth on it. Alright, that's good enough for now. And then just go back to maybe just these 3 spans and smooth it a few times. Alright. Still getting a bit of a normal distortion, but I think that's the best we can do as far as getting the topology to look nice goes, with the exception of just a little bit more tweaking for some stray vert weights in there. So now I'm going to continue going across the back. Alright, we're going to call that good. Still a little bit more polishing that would be done if this was a finished rig, but that's a good point for us to stop and start distributing this lid out. That's doesn't really matter which frame you use or which level of rotation. I'll just keep it somewhere in the middle like that. Now I'm going to add some influence into number 2, and it's going to be stolen directly out of number 1. So assuming everything else is locked, which it is, we are just going to unlock number 2. Don't forget to lock head, actually. Let's turn color feedback back on. So we've got everything we need for our lower lid right here. So we're going to steal from number 1 into number 2. And since we're going to go sequentially across it, you can feel free to grab the whole from this point all the way to the right, so that you can make sure you grab every point from there over of the lower lid influence that you need. That'll make sense in a second. Go to component mode, lasso, and right from around this area over. Since head is locked, we should be safe to flood this. Good. Notice that this whole area is still exactly how we painted it. Let's just smooth that a few times. Let's actually raise it up a little. Maybe 3. Looks pretty good. Now let's lock number 1 and steal from number 2. Into number 3. Let's actually switch what we have keyed though, so it raises the whole lid area. So let's delete these keys, and then key this locator instead. One thing I forgot to mention is that we should have at some point made sure when it actually contacts the upper lid, it's the whole lid contacting it, but for now it's fine. Okay. So we're going to select Or rather, since this selection is still there, we can just deselect the area to the left of this joint. And then flood number 3. And we know we want to smooth 3 times. And before we even check on this, let's just move right on and do number 4. And smooth 3 times. Now, we know that our lid is still working. Let's just make sure each individual one is working. So we've got 1. It's not perfect. You'll see that it's drifting off a little too much. We might have been a little too liberal with the smoothing. We might have wanted to do it individually, but for now it should be fine. Let's check 3 and 4. Looks pretty good. Let's smooth that area out a little bit though. Yeah, for future reference, you'd probably want to manually be doing all the smoothing in here to make sure it doesn't drift too far. Alright, cool. So there we have our whole lower lid set up. Now we're going to move on to the crease. So let's just hide this group, unhide lid crease, and we're going to add this influence in. Make sure it's locked so it doesn't automatically try to change anything. Make sure our lid is working. Yep, we're good. Let's actually get rid of those keys though. We don't need those anymore. So let's go ahead and set a key on this locator here. When I'm painting this, I actually am going to go and raise the lower lid a little bit so we can see what we're doing here. So I'm going to start by painting the lowermost point, or rather the lowermost ring. Just flood that to 100 after we lock all of our lower lids and unlock the head. We're going to steal this from head. Whoops, wrong one. This is the one we want. Alright. So let's just go to frame 2 and start manually smoothing this out. Or, you know what? Let's actually just Control-Shift-I to select everything but that line to make sure the 100% there doesn't go away just yet. We're going to make this go pretty much up into the lid area. Oh, getting some warnings, that's never good. Alright, let's see how that's working. Alright, pretty good. Some issues up there. Sometimes it just doesn't like listening to you when you lock certain joints. If you're getting all these warnings, you're probably going to want to stop smoothing and use the actual replace method. But for now, we're just going to keep on blasting through. I think it's looking pretty good. Might want to add some more influence out to this area. So at this point, let's start distributing them over. Grab this whole area over. Remember, we're just going to be stealing from 1 into 2. See how that turned out? And it's getting a little sloppy. Again, with that smooth thing, it's just not cooperating right now. You might get lucky, you might not. Move on to the next one. Steal from 2 to 3. Cool. And finally 3 to 4. Okay, obviously it's a little buggy, it didn't turn out perfect. If you hop over to the full Kayla though, you can check some reference on how. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you grab them all together, like so. So back over here, all we have left to do, let's just hide this, is the cheek. Very, very simple, just one joint. Let's actually add the influence first. Lock the weights. And lock everything except for head and cheek. And now we're just gonna paint this in right here. It's just going to cover the upper area of the cheek so that it rotates up around the eye nicely. Whoa, it's looking a little nasty. Just go in and tweak it some now. Try to get it to cup that crease area right there. Obviously it's being buggy again, just bear with me, and if you're doing this on your own, just try to be a little bit more careful with your smoothing as you go through it. Alright, it's looking a little gross up in there. Try to get it to taper off. You're also going to want to avoid getting this bulge right here. Just try to get it evenly across. Oh wow, what a beautiful eyelid destruction we caused there. For a finished reference of this, cheek lift. Alright, so we have all of this set up. Let's unhide these and bring it back to 0. So now all that's left to do is to plug these in to corresponding controls on the global rig. You can also feel free to duplicate these all over to the other side of the face, and mirroring your weights will work just fine because each of the bind joints is isolated and not overlapping. So let's go down here. Let's just create a quick circle. Let's actually match it to one of these transforms first to make sure it matches the correct angle. Oops, wrong one. Alright. And just bring this straight back down. Cool. Let's just bring the actual CVs forward. Back to object mode, and it is exactly lined up how we want. Just remember this is the lower lid. Cool. Let's call this left lid lower con. Do a control, or just a located group above it. Looks good. Now we're going to duplicate this. Let's also make sure to freeze history on this. And then duplicate it. Keep the same pivot, remember, but we are going to create 4 little subcontrols right here. And they're just going to sit within the parent of the larger control. So we're just moving the CVs. Call this one 001. Duplicate it again. It's going to be 2, obviously. And then 3 and 4 as well. Just go ahead and parent these right here. They should all stay 0 since they have the same pivot. Alright, looks like we're good. Let's just parent this whole group to this socket control so that it follows along with everything we do that affects the eye area. So now all we have to do, very last step, grab our connection editor and start connecting away. Let's switch this guy out for a new perspective. Move on up here. And let's actually select all these and lock everything except for rotate and scale, because we don't want translation. That'll offset the pivot from the center of the eye. So let's first do the overall control. Let's grab the locator actually. Connect rotate to rotate and scale to scale. Let's make sure that worked. Sweet. Because of how close I modeled her eyelids to the actual geometry, you might end up wanting to scale some of these out a little bit. Maybe on the actual joint. Just let it kind of live like that. Looks like there's a vert we missed back there, but you get the idea. You could also add a corrective if you wanted to as well. So let's grab this guy. I'm just going to assign the actual joint so that if we make any changes, we still have 2 buffers above that to work with. Looks good. Not good, figuratively. Let's go for all of these. Alright, looks good. One last thing, let's actually add our 4 + 1 extra attributes. Lid crease 1, float keyable, lid crease 2, 4, and finally cheek lift. And then just the same process. This is just going to be for rotate X, it looks. Let's make sure that worked. Did not mean to use cheek lift there, actually meant lid crease 1. Good. And finally, cheek lift. Now let's make sure all this worked. 1, 2, 3, 4, and cheek lift. Cool. So that is everything for setting up the lid area, give or take a whole lot of weight finessing. Again, for final reference, I'll just walk you through right here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, cheek lift, and overall rotation. Next up, we're going to talk about setting up ribbons as well as skinning the lip controls.